Got it. Got it. Welcome, YouTube. We'll be on in just a minute. Start the recording in here to the cloud. All right. So welcome everyone to this week's Wetland Watersheds, Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. So this week, Dr. Clark and I are going to fill in. We had a cancellation. Unfortunately, Jahid Islam is not going to be able to talk about it. Underwater robot that he's using with cool machine vision to like guide robots to follow divers and go do all kinds of things underwater. We'll hear about that next semester, hopefully. But so Dr. Clark and I want to give you sort of an update on how recent interpretations of the Clean Water Act have gotten all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. I'm going to focus on a case that was decided in 2020 about groundwater and whether, well, I don't want to give it away. And then he's going to talk about a case that's being heard right now, just heard last week, about, you know, where and when we have jurisdiction over regulating what happens in wetlands and water in the US. So share this. That was good. All right, and if anyone can help me at 12:15, I'm gonna try to do just a half an hour. 12:15, give me like that. Okay, we'll be done. All right. So I'm going to talk about closing this groundwater loophole in the Clean Water Act. Let's have these. There you go. All right, so I'm just showing you this picture here. Anyone know what this is? This is Florida. What is this kind of ecosystem? What we got going on here? Spring. It's a spring, and what do you notice about the spring? Got water in it. It's got water in it. That's good. Okay, that's the good part.
It's covered in algae.
Covered in algae, thanks, Kat. That's awesome, right? And so we of course think about springs in Florida being, you know, changing their status and why algae is growing more in springs. And one of the major hypotheses, although certainly not all the way proven, is the idea of pollution, groundwater pollution, nitrogen, and eutrophication in the spring. So I just put this picture up here as a motivation for how the case I'm about to talk about applies perhaps to Florida. So first, the question is, does the Clean Water Act apply to groundwater? And so before we get started, you know, what do y'all think? Does the Clean Water Act apply to groundwater? I saw a nod. Yeah, it should, right? So, okay, yeah, it should. Well, does anyone know what this building is? The Supreme Court of the United States, right? So this question of whether the Clean Water Act applies to groundwater, to certain groundwaters, was elevated all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was decided in 2020. And I had the chance to be part of a group of scientists that wrote this thing on the right. It was called, it's a friend of the court brief, an amicus brief. And when it's more than one friend, it's a amici brief, amici curiae. And, you know, it was also, I got to be on the cover of a very important magazine, my own departments, you know, like internal magazine, like PR. It's like when your mom tells you you're very good at something, whatever, but so it was fun to get a chance to work on this. And so the question is like, why am I on the cover of this little magazine talking about a Supreme Court case when I'm not a lawyer? These are all David Kaplans. Very easily, and they're all lawyers. Very easily found a bunch of David Kaplan lawyers. Megan, make sure that we've been on the YouTube. Just give me something to chat. So I'm not a lawyer, but I am a hydrologist. And so the question of how did it come to be that I got a chance to work on this was really this accidental intersection. So I'll introduce you to some of these lawyers, one of whom I know just from working in the field. And he said, hey, will you do this thing? We have a need for some expertise in hydrology about this friend of the court brief. So there was a legal need. I had the scientific expertise, or at least enough. And I had this personal or civic interest in being involved. My job as a professor every day, I love teaching. We do research, but sometimes that kind of like ends at the boundary of the university. There was a chance to do something more civically engaged. I found this quote from Tina Fey. She says, say yes, and you'll figure it out afterwards. So I said yes. I don't know that 2 years on, I don't know if I stick by this quote. I think you need to be careful to what, you know, all the things you say yes to. But anyway, I said yes. And I was kicking myself sometimes, you know, like juggling a baby in one arm, or like, you know, writing this at night. But anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about it. Very brief history of the Clean Water Act. And Dr. Clark's going to talk more about this. So 1948, there was the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. In the early 70s, there was a lot of environmental movement going on in the 60s and 70s, sort of culminating in the early 70s with the formation of the EPA, the passage of the Clean Water Act that we know in 1972. And they had this explicit goal to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And that word nation's waters is going to come up a lot in what I'm talking about and what Dr. Clark is talking about. So it doesn't mean that you can no longer pollute. Of course, we know that you can pollute, right? You need now, after the Clean Water Act, you need a permit before you discharge a pollutant from a point source to a navigable water. And the reason those are bold and italics and blue is these are all legal terms that we're going to talk about in a little bit of depth, and defining what is a discharge, well, what is a pollutant, what is a point source, and particularly what is a navigable water are at the heart of this Supreme Court case. And the stuff in green there, you also need a permit to dredge or fill in wetlands, and Mark will talk more about that. So at the core of all of these decisions are the POTUS, the WOTUS, and the SCOTUS. So you know what the POTUS is? President of the United States. I already said what SCOTUS is the Supreme Court. How about the WOTUS? Waters of the United States. And so it all comes down to what are the waters of the United States. Here's a picture of a sort of a generic watershed, and I won't get too deeply into it, but the Clean Water Act traditionally has been interpreted to apply to navigable waters. These control interstate commerce, so they're covered in like the Commerce Clause in Chapter 3 or whatever, Section 3 of the Constitution. Have always been considered under the Clean Water Act as being jurisdictional, meaning they're covered by the Clean Water Act. With time, we came to understand that tributaries were important to maintaining the status of the navigable water. So discharging pollutants into tributaries, you needed a permit. What became more unclear is which wetlands are being covered as waters of the United States. Again, more with the Sackett case in about a half an hour. And what hadn't been covered before was this other flow, which was groundwater. And traditionally, at least as interpreted for 50 years, 48 years, the Clean Water Act did not cover groundwater pollution or pollutant discharge, point source discharge to groundwater. And that's what this case is all about. So we'll talk about the brief, just very briefly. This is what the brief looks like. Oh, I have it in my office. I'll go get it when we do the switch. It's like a little green book, and they literally print it out. And like, so this little green book that I helped write was in the hands of these 9 justices of the Supreme Court. It was really kind of really a cool thing. And it was facilitated by these 5 lawyers. Okay, let's do it. All right. Yes. Okay. These 5 lawyers, including Royal Gardner, who wrote this cool book, Lawyers, Swamps, and Money, which is a really great story about sort of, the environmental permitting process of nationally, but particularly in Florida, and some other lawyers there. And then there were 4. There were these 4 scientists, myself, Dr. Mark Raines, who's now the chief scientist for the state of Florida. These guys whose name, Thomas Harder from UC Davis on the left, and this gentleman from the University of Maine on the right. I have to say that the 2 Floridians in the middle, yeah, I know this is being recorded, but we wrote, I'd say 95% of it. These guys are awesome scientists, but I think they were very busy at the time. They might have said yes. Anyway, so we wrote this thing, and it was also co-signed by a bunch of scientific organizations. So you'll recognize the Society for Wetland Scientists, Society of Freshwater Scientists, the American Fisheries Society, Society of Limnology and Oceanography, a bunch of aquatic sciences, scientific organizations that co-signed onto this brief. So what does it look like? At the top of the brief, they say there's this question, whether the Clean Water Act requires a permit for the discharge of pollutants when the pollutants travel through groundwater from, that word from, it's been a day on the word from, we'll get to it in a minute, from a point source to a navigable water. Critical that we're talking about a point source. So this is not non-point source pollution. This is some point source that you can point to a navigable water. And then we laid out kind of like, almost like we would lay out a paper. We gave a background on what groundwater is, how we know the way the groundwater flows through the landscape. So like, what are the scientific tools and methods we use to understand where groundwater moves and what it brings with it? And then this third part, a statement. The Clean Water Act requires the consideration of the science regarding groundwater and surface water connections. So probably the only time that the Supreme Court has ever considered this otherwise sort of esoteric topic of groundwater surface water connection, which we talk a lot about in science. So that's what it looked like. And I'm not going to go through the entire brief because the brief is written like almost like a high school or an undergraduate level course in groundwater hydrology. So it looks like this. I literally put in the definition of an aquifer, the different types of aquifers, where the water in aquifers comes from. And I think it was kind of helpful because, you know, I am a hydrologist generally, but I don't specialize as a groundwater hydrologist. I'm not Dr. Mike Annable or Dr. Lou Motes. So when I was trying to figure out how to write this, I was sort of like, all right, well, how do we know that, right? It wasn't so inherent to me. So I was able to write it. I think at like the Supreme Court is very full of smart people, whether you like their politics or not. So you don't need to write it at a first grade level, but you can't write it at a graduate student level either, because they don't know about all the science that we've developed over 12, 15 years of study. So as individuals, I mean, so I talk about what groundwater storage is, show that there's these robust scientific methods to track the ways that groundwater moves, so we know we can understand where different contaminants are going, we can measure them, we can model them. And, you know, it ended up being, you know, 20, 25 pages or so of background on groundwater. And we'll see if they used it or not. All right, so let's go to the case. The case actually was the County of Maui versus the Hawaii wildlife defenders and other plaintiffs. So this is Hawaii. Everything in red there is Maui County. The island of Maui looks like this. And unfortunately, no, I did not actually get to go there as part of this case. I got to write it here from Florida. But when I see these pictures of Maui, it almost just looks exactly like this classic picture we look at the water cycle, that we look at the water cycle. With these flows of water from the atmosphere to the land, to the groundwater, surface water storage. And it raises this question, where does groundwater end and surface water begin? So you've got atmospheric water, rain, it becomes surface water, it sometimes becomes groundwater and then becomes surface water again. And so if the Clean Water Act is only applying to surface water, well, it applies here and it applies here, but what if there's water moving through the groundwater, does it apply there? And that was at the heart of this question. And so you might ask, why not Florida? And this case could very easily or equally been well heard in Florida if that's where the case came from, because we have surface water and groundwater just in very obvious direct connection here in our springs. And largely the pollution that we're seeing in our springs is from non-point source pollution, but if there was a point source, the same question about whether groundwater was required a permit would apply. All right. So this is Maui now. There are two lobes, about 160,000 people or so on Maui. On this western lobe, there's this water treatment plant, the Lahaina Wastewater Facility, serves about 40,000 people. And if you zoom in, it's about 500 meters to the coast. So even back in 1973, when they were permitting this thing, which has some well injection, wastewater that's injected in the groundwater, they said, well, the environmental review said the effluent will eventually get into the ocean. You didn't require a degree in hydrology to know that water's flowing downhill. And if you put some water in the ground near the ocean, water's going to go downhill and hit the ocean. But we needed a little bit more than sort of anecdotal or suggested evidence to get this all the way to the Supreme Court. This is what the facility looks like. Recently, they upgraded to tertiary treatment. So the water quality enhancements and treatments at the wastewater plant are very good, including for nutrients after some upgrades. 3 to 4 million gallons a day of retreated wastewater are injected into the ground via 4 wells. And it's something like 200 feet down into the shallow aquifer. Wastewater that's treated very well, injected into the ground, no permit required. At least, well, we'll see. They need one now. I don't want to give it away. No permits were required, but the wastewater eventually flows to the groundwater and goes down to the coast, and particularly in this area over here, this Kahekili Beach Park, where the effects of eutrophication and basically nutrient addition to the coastal sea were being noticed. That's what the facility looks like. So, I mean, you can see all condos, all this sort of like development, vacation land, and really an ecologically very special place. Right there by that Kahekili Beach is the Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary. All these coral reefs, in fact, the coral reefs were the place where the first sort of negative effects of the wastewater outflows, the wastewater discharges were being seen. And then it's popular just economically as well as environmentally as a place to go hang out on the beach and see turtles and stuff like that. Okay. So I'm going to give 2 slides, one about the science and one about the sort of legal interpretation, and then we'll check the time and we'll see how we're doing. The cliff notes of the science summary is more than half of that injected wastewater, it flows down this way, more than half of it discharges to the coast, and it takes about a year. The average residence time or travel time of a drop of water injected into that shallow aquifer is about a year. Some gets there more quickly, 80 or so days, some longer, about a year residence time. It brings with it both nitrogen and phosphorus pollution that is directly traceable or the Supreme Court would say at least fairly traceable to the source, and it's been harming coral reefs and other marine life. So a bunch of science, USGS, EPA, folks from academia, 15 or so years of science to say that in 1973, they said the wastewater is going to get to the ocean. Yeah, it gets to the ocean, and it's having these effects. So that's the science summary. The legal summary, when they come to the legal decision, right? The court, the justices all vote, and the majority wins. And then they write this thing, it's their decision. And sometimes they write more than one if there's a dissenting opinion. And it has a syllabus just like your class. And it was argued, it was decided on April 23rd, and spoiler alert, hydrologists should be happy. Big Supreme Court ruling bolsters groundwater science. So we'll talk about their interpretation in a moment. How did they come to this decision? It was a 6-3 vote, 6 in favor of saying that indeed groundwater that was going to end up in surface water needs to be regulated as if it was a surface water point source discharge. And this is probably the best part of the whole thing of being involved. During our oral arguments of the case, Stephen Breyer remarked, the briefs laying out the science of tracking groundwater pollution had really impressed him. This is a quote. The scientists really convinced me they're geniuses and they can trace all kinds of things. So I was like, I put that on my CV and I'm like, well, I'm going to retire. Probably remains the coolest thing I've ever been involved with. It would be cool if he said that and we lost the case, but the fact that we also won the case and groundwater is now being considered as potentially requiring a permit for discharge if it is functionally equivalent to a discharge to a surface water. So Breyer gave the opinion with Roberts and Ginsburg, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Kavanaugh. So this was before Ginsburg passed away, and Justice Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito were the no votes. So here is like the brief overview of how they came to this decision, the legal part. They said the Clean Water Act prohibits any addition of any pollutant, and this treated wastewater is a pollutant, from any point source, and it's critical that it's a point source. Because some people are like, well, a well is not really a point source because it doesn't discharge to a surface water. But we'll say well is actually the word well is in the Clean Water to a navigable waters without a permit. So that is forbidden. So the environmental groups, it's like Environment Defense Fund in Hawaii, sued. They said that the County of Maui was discharging a pollutant to a navigable water. So that's not allowed under the Clean Water Act. It went to the district court, the local district court there, and they found that that discharge into the groundwater was functionally a discharge into a navigable water. The ocean is a navigable water, right? Get on your boat, your kayak, your stand-up paddleboard, whatever. You can navigate in there. You cannot navigate in the groundwater unless you're a pollutant, okay? But the district court said, yes, that discharge was functionally the same as if you were putting it into the water of the US. It got appealed again. The Ninth Circuit Court affirmed and said that the permit was required when the pollutants were fairly traceable. So if you know that that pollutant was from that source and it was functionally equivalent to putting it in the water of the US, then yeah, you know what, you need a permit for that. And all the Supreme Court did with all these arguments was they held the opinion of the Ninth Circuit Court. They kept that opinion and they said, statute requires a permit when there is a point source into a navigable water or its functional equivalent. We already knew the navigable water thing, but the functional equivalent. So we have functional equivalent. So of course the Supreme Court justices are lawyers. So if they, make difficult tests, then it's like job security for more lawyers. That is the idea, is that, okay, if it's functionally equivalent to a discharge to the water of the US, then groundwater discharge needs a permit. So I think I'm going to get through all this because I'm just had a lot of coffee today. All right, a little bit deeper dive on how the science was done. All right, we've got this set up where we've got sort of volcanic island, we've got rain, we've got groundwater, we've got surface water. You don't need to understand all of this, but it's connected. The idea that groundwater and surface water are somehow separate doesn't work in Florida. It doesn't work in places with volcanic islands, and it doesn't work in this case. So the question is the injected wastewater making it to the coast? And this ice cream cone with 3 flavors is representing the 3 flavors of science that they did to answer this question. Does the injected wastewater get to the coast? And you'll excuse me, I'll go pretty briefly through these. The first flavor was they tracked the nitrogen in seaweed at the coast. And it had the same isotopic signature as wastewater being discharged into the aquifer. Now, I'm not a isotopic biogeochemist or anything, but they went and collected all these algae that were these seaweeds that were growing along the coast. And they measured the delta 15N of that algae, which is an isotopic signature of the nitrogen inside the biomass of the algae. And because of the way that plants take up nutrients, you can sort of track where the nitrogen comes from. Was it from manure and septic waste? Was it from soil? Was it from fertilizer? And well, lo and behold, the delta 15N nitrogen in naturally occurring nitrogen and fertilizer was not what like this seaweed looked like. The seaweed looked like coming from manure and septic waste. It looked very much like the waste from the Lahaina water reclamation facility. So the algae that was growing there, the seaweed that was growing there, had the signature of wastewater in it. So that was fairly traceable back to the source. The next thing they did is they looked at the temperature anomaly. So there was a plume of water that from the groundwater that discharges to the coast. I mean, that's happening all around the island, but there was this hot plume. So they did these nighttime surveys with planes. It was before there were drones readily available, and they just measured the infrared measurement of the temperature. And they found that the wastewater treatment plant inflow was about 30 degrees C. These known seeps were about 28. The plume boundary was about 26.5, and the open ocean was around 25 degrees. So they found a temperature signature of the wastewater. They found its chemical signature, then they found the temperature signature, and they say, well, it's about 160 acre area of wastewater plume, measurable by the temperature. The third flavor was they said, all right, it's pretty convincing, but how do we know it's really the temperature is not from a parking lot? How do we know that the wastewater is not from someone's septic tank? So they said, all right, well, let's inject something that we can trace into the groundwater at the wastewater treatment plant and follow it. And maybe you've seen stuff like this, these dye studies before. You can turn. This is St. Patrick's Day in the Chicago River. This is our own good friend Nathan Reaver doing this on the Silver River and the Gemini Springs. You put some kind of tracer, either a conservative salt or a fluorescent dye, and you track it. You can look at it visually. Of course, underground you can't do that, but you can take samples. And so what they did is you inject this dye down here, and you kind of sit down here and you wait. You wait in the ocean, and every day you take a grab sample and you measure it, and you measure it, and you measure it. Maybe they had a fluorometer out there. You measure it over time and you see, whoop, there's the dye coming out. First arrival 84 days later, the mean travel time about a year. And this curve represents the transport of that dye from the injected wastewater wells through the aquifer down to the beach. And it arrived at the beach across a variety of times, had a variety of residence times, with the average was about a year. And so the first arrival was about 3 months, average time a year. And using this method, they can also separate sort of like what proportion of the groundwater discharging in that region was from the plant versus just the ambient background concentration. And they can figure out the load of nutrients or waste going to the coral reefs from the wastewater treatment plant. You can get the nutrient load directly from those wells. I'd say there was 3 flavors, right? They did it for the science was clear, and the science was summarized in the case that the Supreme Court heard. So now how was the science interpreted? They got to think very thoughtfully. They're smart people. They have to do everything from eviction policy to environmental law to, taxes. They have to be very, smart folks. And the analogy is that the lawyers bring to help them understand the case are really intriguing. And so the first one was about if you bring whiskey to a party. Now you guys probably don't even go to parties anymore since COVID, right? Now, you certainly go to a party, there's never a punch bowl, right? Back in the day, there would be this punch bowl, and people would take whiskey in a flask and they would put it in the punch bowl, and then everyone would get drunk and they didn't even know it. So the lawyer from Maui said, well, if I was at home and I put whiskey in my flask, and then I brought it to the party and put it in the punch bowl, you wouldn't say that the whiskey came from my bottle at home. You'd say the whiskey came from my flask. And he's trying to say, well, the contamination is coming from the groundwater. It's not coming from the plant. Well, then the lawyer for the defenders of the environment in Hawaii was like, no. When I go to the grocery store, I put the groceries in my car and then I take them into my house. But I wouldn't say I got groceries at my car, right? No, the groceries came from the store. In other words, the wastewater came from the plant. Okay, so this is the kind of arguments that were heard over the course of a couple of weeks. Suppose that a sewage treatment plant discharges polluted water into the ground. And they even said, what if I've got a plant, wastewater. It's like I'm on a river, but I put it into the ground 5 feet from the river. Oh, not covered by the Clean Water Act. And the justices, the six who agreed that a discharge like that should be covered, like that doesn't make any sense. And so the idea of if it's a point source, if it's fairly traceable, then it is functionally equivalent to a point source discharge to a surface water. And they even spent some time thinking like from and to, and what are you talking about? So I'll just do sort of two more slides on the interpretation. The first was about the idea that the wells at this wastewater treatment plant could be considered a point source. The lawyers from Maui said, no, a well can't be a point source. The other lawyer said, the act defines pollutant broadly, a point source, any discernible, confined, discrete conveyance from which pollutants are or may be discharged, including container pipe, ditch, channel, tunnel, conduit. And the last word written in 1972, or well. So like, okay, a well can be a point source. When the Ninth Circuit heard it, they said, well, this is fairly traceable. It's got the isotopic characteristic of the wastewater. So we passed fairly traceable. But then Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas were like, well, what about like a septic tank? I could trace wastewater to a septic tank, and then like everyone in the whole country who's on septic needs a permit to discharge a groundwater. And they said, well, no, because that's sort of like a mix of different pollutants from a lot of different places. So the Clean Water Act's legislative history, they sort of assured the lawyers that would not cause every individual to need a permit for discharge of wastewater from something like a municipal or a residential septic. And then the last bit of interpretation was this question of functionally equivalent. And so folks had thought that it was surprising that the Supreme Court went as far as they did to set up sort of mechanism to test what does functionally equivalent mean. Again, saying some words, pipe going into water, definitely covered by Clean Water Act. Well, going into groundwater that then goes into the surface water, is it functionally equivalent to that pipe? So how about the transit time? How about the distance travel? How about what it's flowing through? So it set up the Supreme Court, these justices, not these hydrogeologists, set up these 7 sort of tests by which future cases could be decided whether functional equivalence was met or not. And in short, it's complicated. So I use this in like every class, and it says it's memorably hilarious, but it's not. So, all right, okay, so I'll wrap it up by saying the broader lesson is, did the wastewater travel underground and contaminate the reef? Maui said, no, we just can't know that. It's unknowable. A bunch of scientists did science on that and reported about it. And the Hawaii Defenders of Wildlife said, yeah, it is knowable. Here's some reasons why. So as academics, we are often handling this kind of scientific problem. Do we know it? How well do we know it? What's the uncertainty? But we don't regularly handle it as a legal problem. It's usually outside of our wheelhouse. We don't get like extra tenure points for it. We don't get extra. Sometimes we, as if you've been following the news recently in Florida, sometimes we get in trouble when we share our opinions in the legal arena. And in this case, we overcame this by, this is supposed to be a Venn diagram, but anyway, the combination of there was a legal need, we had personal and civic interest, and we had the scientific expertise. So I think I will stop it there and take any quick questions about the groundwater case and then transition to Dr. Clark. Yes, Adrian.
What was the process for choosing you and the other scientists to write this? And generally, is there like a screening or evaluation?
I think some other people said no, and so I don't know. I knew Royal Gardner from because I had invited him to give a talk about Clean Water Act before here. So I like know him on Twitter, and so he was just I think looking for hydrologists. I first told him I was like, I'm not like groundwater's not like my special thing. He's like, oh, that's fine. I gave him Wendy Graham, I gave him Mike Gamble. Hi guys. They must have said no, I don't know what happened. And so I think you just look for experts who are willing to like, you know, that Venn diagram to work for.
So how possible would it be for someone to just like influence it such that the scientists who are on this are like have some kind of bias or are not really experts and that influences a lot? So
an amicus brief or like a friend of the court brief can be written by anyone. So there could have been a whole group of hydrogeologists that thought the opposite of this, and they could have written one, and they could have been, you know, I wasn't paid for this. It wasn't like I didn't get, you know, any compensation. So, but I had this civic interest. You know, you can imagine the County of Maui was maybe looking for experts that had a different opinion. And they called experts, I don't know if they called them at the actual Supreme Court hearing, but in the circuit court case where the appeal was, tons of scientific, what do you call it, testimony occurred. Any other questions? Yeah. Fair.
So this was a case against the County of Maui, and now that it's been defined in the Clean Water Act, if there is pollution coming from a groundwater source, does it not have to be contested again? Like, I'm assuming that there is groundwater pollution coming from a lot of places that just haven't been defined yet. So how is this applicable to other situations?
Yeah, so basically the entities that implement the Clean Water Act in any state, here at DEP, is our state agency that deals with the Clean Water Act and discharge pollutant limits and things like that. And so they would either need to integrate the groundwater, like this functional equivalence test in their permitting process, or if the environmental group thought it was insufficient, they would sue. And the statute would be on the books, like the precedent would be that, if there was a functional equivalent shown, then they would have to include permitting for it. But I don't think, if you go to Nebraska or something and there's a groundwater discharge, it's, maybe it's 1,000 years before any of that groundwater pollution gets to a navigable water. Is that functionally equivalent? Probably argue no, it's not functionally equivalent. Then again, I think we'll talk about the complications of defining when and where the jurisdiction applies. It's not a bright line. And in the Supreme Court, some of the justices like these bright lines where it's like, if you're here, you got to do it. If you're here, you don't have to do it. But the reason it got to the Supreme Court is because it's not a bright line, it's a pretty hazy line. So the states that implement the Clean Water Act are going to have to abide by this rule. We're going to let you get up here.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
All right, so I don't have a set of Google searches related to whether I'm a lawyer or not. I definitely am not a lawyer, and therefore that's a huge caveat with all this. However, anybody that's in wetlands or any sort of water resources definitely should have their ears, well up to see what the court is going to decide on this. But this is not the first case that's been challenged. So big question here is, why does this keep coming up to the Supreme Court? And one question would be, well, basically, is the issue with the goals of the Clean Water Act? And the answer is no, not really. Basically, they are pretty sound. Basically, the general public wants to protect the waters of the nation for reasons of maintaining physical, chemical, and biological integrity. Okay, so we know that they are indeed national waters. We want to protect them because they are the public's resource. Number two is the issue whether or not the Clean Water Act should apply to the nation's water. And again, no. Basically, once that water is indeed defined as a public resource, i.e., a nation's water, it's a public resource, then the question of whether or not that CWA should apply is not really there. The real issue is the last one, is where exactly should the Clean Water Act be applied? And that's dependent on whether or not that water body is a clean or a water of the United States. Now, as David indicated earlier, navigable was kind of the original relationship. And navigable is pretty clear, whether or not you can put a vessel in it and you can paddle it. And in the old days, it would have been, could you canoe it? In the modern days, it's more of a, a ship of commerce, basically it had to have, it's under the Commerce Clause. So that was relatively clear, but that has incrementally inched its way up, because to protect that navigable water under the Clean Water Act for the purposes of physical, chemical, and biological integrity, the question becomes how many other things hydrologically have to connect to that to truly protect it? And so what is the extent to which this Clean Water Act, and specifically the nation's water, where does that need to apply? Where is that line up there in the landscape? And what's interesting, even though David's case essentially focused primarily on the water quality side of this, physical and biological, essentially biological is responding to chemical, but the physical side of this, the quantity of water perhaps, is not related necessarily to a point discharge. It's the other connectivities. And so the idea of functional equivalency, although pretty well measured and very well scientifically connected back to that point source of the well and the groundwater, this hydrologic connectivity is one that becomes this question of functional equivalent. If we had a discharge from a creek that went right into that navigable water, that would be quantified as that volume that flowed in. But if it's subsurface or some alternative connect, what is that functional equivalent? And we'll get to this idea of what constitutes significance, because that becomes even a bigger challenge. Okay, so just to back it up a little bit, because this is, again, this most recent case is not the only one that's been challenging this question of what is the extent under which the Clean Water Act applies, because the implications of being a wetland, and that's really what this case is versus whether or not it falls under the Clean Water Act from a point discharge, has huge implications for property owners. And most wetlands exist not on public lands, but on private lands. So when a wetland becomes jurisdictional, then all of a sudden the implications of what you can do on your land being a wetland changes. And that has some implications under the Fifth Amendment. But either way, in 2001, early on, after the original act was signed in 72, the US EPA used to claim jurisdiction over isolated wetlands because those wetlands were being used by migratory waterfowl. And under the Commerce Clause, there was something called the Migratory Bird Rule. They were claiming that those wetlands were important for this interstate commerce. So that's how they were claiming jurisdiction over isolated wetlands. In 2001, the Supreme Court basically ruled against that the bird use of these areas alone could not be enough to declare that equivalency of a navigable water, and that basically the Supreme Court noting that the term navigable must be given meaning within the context and application of the statute. And migratory waterfowl doesn't relate to navigable waters, at least in the Supreme Court's mind at the time. And so it resulted in this somewhat uncertainty as to what exactly would be a connection to this navigable water. If it's not by birds and that commerce, what is the connection to navigable? So it's kind of, they isolated one, but didn't clarify necessarily that definition. The more pertinent one, especially with regards to the present case, was heard in 2006, Rapanos versus United States. This was a case that actually was challenging whether or not a very convoluted connectivity to a truly navigable water was indeed also a water of the United States. And those were all surface connections at the time of that case. Basically, it challenged the degree of which this surface connectivity to wetlands that were being developed and, through basically a drainage or tributaries, but these were surface connections, okay? And there was no discussion here about groundwater, and that's where, again, it comes up as the challenge under the present situation. But at that time, the Supreme Court ruled in a 4-1-4 split. So basically, there was no clear precedent set by the court at that time. However, they had opinions, and those opinions are essentially what rule the day now. And depending on which of these two you choose, you basically will tend to weight where you fall on this what is a waters of the United States or not. And so Justice Kennedy, which was on one side, and this really boils it down. There's a whole, I don't know if they have actually a course on this over in the law school, but they could. But fundamentally, Justice Kennedy took a position that would arguably be more scientifically determined as to whether or not something was connected. And in his opinion, he specifically said, if this wetland could be identified as being significantly affecting the chemical, physical, or biological integrity, essentially using the goals of the Clean Water Act in his interpretation of whether or not it's clean water or a water of the United States, basically that would be the determination. That would be the test, is to determine whether or not it has a quote unquote significant nexus with regards to the connectivity of a wetland in question and this truly navigable or essentially water downstream, which would then make it a water of the United States. Opposing that, and again, we're going to touch on in the last slide, this issue of bright lines, okay, in Justice Scalia's opinion, basically, it was much more narrowly defined. And if that water body was not connected at the surface almost continuously with a no navigable water, it would not be considered a water of the United States. And so if you know anything about wetlands, their ephemerality, you basically would be ruling out a whole lot of wetlands as to whether or not they would fall under a number one navigable water / water of the United States and therefore protected under the Clean Water Act. And in fact, there was an estimate done that if the EPA started to define whether or not a wetland was falling under the Clean Water Act, based on Justice Scalia's ruling, roughly half of the presently protected federal wetlands that are out there would no longer be covered. So a huge number of wetlands would pretty much be taken out of any sort of protection under the Clean Water Act if this surface connection, almost permanent surface connection, was the criteria by which that water body was there. Okay. So who exactly should be determining this decision? And this is actually something that probably is underlying some of these court decisions and some questions about whether or not states' rights actually apply. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. But basically, prior to roughly the 2001 for sure, but 2006 ruling, There was actually a case called Chevron and versus the Natural Resources Defense Council in 1984, which essentially deferred to the regulatory agencies as the experts to determine whether or not that water body, in this case, a wetland, was indeed connected or basically should be regulated under those acts. And so they, in the past, the Supreme Court kind of deferred to the agency because they were the experts, just like the science that was applied in the case that David was talking about, and the scientific expertise was used to actually make this connectivity. The idea was, well, the agencies have that science, not the courts, not the, the lawyers per se and whatnot. And in fact, Justice Stevens, when the Rapano's case came up, argued that that particular ruling should go back to the agencies to be the determinant. And so there was still a certain degree of desire for the agencies to be the ones that interpret that. But from a political standpoint, that always doesn't flush water. Basically, you have to get involved for other reasons. So starting in 2015, not 2015, basically there were efforts to try to be more a priority in that decision, literally lay this map over the landscape as to where exactly those boundaries would be determined. Even though there was internal guidance within agencies, it was still pretty much a site-specific determination that was oftentimes made as to whether or not that water body or wetland would be regulated. So the Obama administration tried to clarify this in 2015 under what they call the Clean Water Rule. Trump administration repealed the Clean Water Rule and basically came up with another rule called Navigable Waters Protection Rule in 2020. And Obama administration then reversed that and now has signed a petition or an agreement basically with themselves, I guess, to temporarily go back to the pre-2015 status of things, which essentially rolls it back to the internal guidance that's really been in place since about the late or mid 1980s, but update it to the decisions that were made in the court, meaning the SCOTUS decisions. But then it's left with this uncertainty as well. Which decision are they going to update to? Is it going to be the Kennedy decision or the Scalia decision? Because depending on which of those roads you go down, it comes up with a very different sort of end game as to how you're going to, what percentage of that landscape. Remember, if you take the Scalia definition, you just drop about 50% of the wetlands that are presently protected. If you take the Kennedy decision, then you might actually pick up more wetlands. So it's unclear to me as to which way they're going to go when they essentially revise with regards to their update and inclusion of the Supreme Court justices. Okay, so there's not a lot of detail here, but what we've got now before the Supreme Court, which is once again going to try to clarify where exactly is this line in the landscape that is going to determine the extent to which this Clean Water Act applies, meaning where exactly is the extent of navigable waters / waters in the United States. So this is a husband and wife basically that own property next to a lake in Idaho called Priest Lake. That lake is in every definition a navigable water. So the water body downstream is definitely navigable water. That's not in question. They, in preparation for building a home, filled in their lot and basically was going without any question as to what was available to them in their own private property. But EPA basically ordered them to remove that fill because they, meaning EPA, claimed that that was a wetland upon which they basically had added this fill, which under the Clean Water Act would basically be filling in, and they would have had to have a permit to conduct that activity if indeed or when indeed it is a wetland. So the original suit actually occurred back in 2008, and it's basically been floundering around in courts for quite a while, like 14 years. And finally, it's before the Supreme Court, which was argued last Tuesday, whatever, maybe it was Monday. But the two general positions, and again, I'm not going into all the detail, but EPA basically is suggesting or stating that that wetland is connected to the navigable water, not by a surface connection, because there's actually a road between this property and the lake, but instead that this connection is via a shallow surface water, shallow subsurface water. It's flowing underground, connecting the wetland in question to this navigable water. So they are taking the precedent that now a groundwater connection is indeed enough to justify this being a protected water under the Clean Water Act. The plaintiffs, however, believe, and really taking not only Scalia's side, but really pushing it to a much even further extent, that waters of this state should be limited to traditionally navigable waters and interstate navigable waters that link with other modes of transportation. So that other modes of transportation means that even if that potentially navigable water, if that potentially navigable water is not actually connected with like a port or something like that, it wouldn't count. So even though you could put a canoe in it, if that canoe doesn't have like a trading host, then basically it doesn't count. It has to actually be used by. And so even, I mean, a lot of the arguments out there that that's probably that degree of connectivity is probably not sound, but just fundamentally it's back to this idea that it really has to be something that's a permanent connection. It has to be navigable water, meaning paddleable or whatnot. And once again, here's the case. That was heard October 3rd. They think the ruling would come out in 2023, but that doesn't mean it's going to be next year, maybe even longer. I don't know. I guess I don't know really how long it takes. But from this stuff, what I pull out of this is a lot of broader considerations that kind of need to be taken into consideration. And as David mentioned before, both the regulators and the regulated would love to have a very clear, clean test, bright line to say, here it is on one side, wetland, here it is on the other side, not a wetland. Okay. So that's what everybody's seeking. And that's why sometimes these decisions that come down seem to be very primitive and basic. So on one hand, we have this idea of a continuous surface connection. Well, that would be really pretty easy to determine. If you showed up and you said it was a wetland, but your feet weren't wet, guess what? It's not a wetland. If you had used that test, fundamentally, you'd have to have a permanent surface connection. And if your feet were wet, you should be able to walk far enough and get in your canoe and start paddling away. Okay, so that would be a very bright line, but the science really doesn't support that sort of thing, okay? Because it would also have to, I mean, under Scalia's definition, you would not even have an ephemeral stream that would be flowing during a rain event as a navigable water, which gets back to this idea of a tributary and whether or not it's feasible. So then we get to the question of a significant nexus, which from a scientific standpoint makes a lot more sense, right? It is this logical connectivity, almost verbatim defined by the Clean Water Act. The problem is there was a huge amount of science that was conducted to establish that connectivity. That almost needs a site-specific determination, because hydrologically, if you were in a different geology, that time lag that it took to move the nutrients, maybe the assimilation capacity of that environment may have been different. So there's a lot of work and a lot of expense that has to go into making that or verifying that connectivity. Okay. The other thing, though, is even with that, there's this idea of a significant nexus. Okay. It doesn't say a nexus. It doesn't say you just have to prove there's a connection. No, it has to be significant. Well, who defines what's significant? And is it in time? Is it quantity? This functional equivalency? We actually struggle with that a little bit. The state of Florida has something called the minimum flows and levels. And it's the idea that we're trying to a priori protect water bodies that for their natural resources or various other uses. And it has a determination that you can't have significant harm. You can actually allow harm, but you can't allow significant harm. Well, who defines that? If science can quantify the reduction of the use of this passage 20% of the time from a manatee because the water levels get too low, is that too much? Should it only be 5%? Maybe it's 50%. I don't know. Who decides that? Does science decide that or society? And then, there's this other question here with regards to who should decide. Is it the federal agencies, as in Scalia's decision and previous decisions that have essentially deferred to those experts? Should it be the court? Well, the court's usually the finality of that decision, because sooner or later they got to make the decision. But they're not necessarily scientists. They're just trying to aggregate all of the information that's out there. Should it be Congress? I mean, the court has essentially deferred some decisions and said, we're going to kick it back to Congress and hope they make a decision, which God forbid they can make any decision. But then you have the states and local rights. Should a state actually, even though it's a federal law and they want to basically look at the connectivity across states of water bodies, should some of those go to individual states? And so here's a quote that recently made, but it just shows some of the perceptions about the role of an agency, basically the ones that are federally responsible for protecting these waters for the public's resource, relative to perhaps those that are regulated, relative to the local understanding of those areas and whether or not that should be taken into consideration. And basically, I'll just leave it at that. We're not going to define who said it, but either way, it's kind of an interesting place where we're at. But either way, this decision has huge implications, not just for whether or not that wetland is protected or not, but the implications of how do we tie this landscape that is 100% connected. I mean, not 100%, but it's really connected. Hydrologically, there are connections all over the place. The rate at which things move, how fast, the quantities, those are all potentially varying degrees of measurable, but the bigger question is what is the extent to which that connectivity has to be verified to say it indeed is protective under the Clean Water Act, and therefore what landscape should be captured. So with that, I guess I'll throw it out there for questions along this time.
About 5 minutes, well, about 1 minute.
Yeah.
You're welcome to stay and talk about wetlands all day, if you like, but so any questions for Dr. Clark about this most recent case of defining what is and what isn't a wetland? Yeah, sure.
A question, does drought for any period of time, months to years, affect the way that a wetland might be more or less connected to the water? WOTUS source?
Therein lies the question, is what is that significance? You know, if it's 1 in every 5 years, is that enough? I don't know. You know, basically, if it's got to be a permanent connection, then any drought, any change in hydraulic, any change in rainfall, you pretty much would have to have this steady supply fundamentally to maintain that connection. And so, I mean, in reality, determining whether or not it's a quote unquote wetland, whether or not it's a regulated wetland or not, that would be very much determined by, you know, it's basically the duration and frequency of flooding that maintains the conditions that develop as a wetland. But whether or not it would fit then under some jurisdiction that the federal government would identify, that's kind of the question here. Because this really isn't asking whether or not it's a wetland. It's really asking whether or not that wetland falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government, because many states have adopted other criteria that would protect wetlands. But this is really about whether the federal government has jurisdiction and therefore whether or not the Clean Water Act applies.
Any questions from Zoom out there? Really just cat. So what about the idea that, you know, the connection is what protects the wetland like jurisdictionally, but like sometimes the disconnection. So a wetland being receiving water and nutrients and agrochemicals and then doing a good job taking care of them and being distant from a stream is like sort of its societal and environmental benefit is from its disconnection. So
yeah, and that's where, you know, the functionality and whether or not it's for water quality or quantity purposes. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to untangle in here. And again, it comes down to whether or not we really want the science to drive that decision, which makes it that much more complex to make that determination. Versus like if you're a homeowner and you own property, I tell you, the majority of calls, I'm an extension specialist, but the majority of times I get contacted, it's about, I'm about to buy property. Are there wetlands on it? If there are, what can I do with them? That's the primary thing. And they're not going to want me to respond and say, oh, well, we'll have to do a study for 10 years to determine if that number one is a wetland. That can be determined pretty quickly. But whether or not that wetland in the state of Florida is a little different because we protect our wetlands regardless of whether or not they're under the federal jurisdiction. But let's just say you were in a state that only had federal protection. And basically the determination of whether or not you could do something with your property was based on whether or not it was indeed a water of the United States. That may take time if it was under this significant nexus to which you'd have to do a study to determine is that connectivity valid. Unless it was done a priori somehow that said all groundwater within some circumference of a navigable water, you know, like i.e. 500 yards away from all, you know, surface water bodies would now be connected. So I think that's the big challenge with approaching this from a more scientific standpoint where we indeed can show connectivity. So yeah, I don't.
I mean, if it protects the biological integrity of the downstream water, that's the question, right? And so showing that it protects it despite being disconnected is probably a stone too far. I don't know.
I don't know.
Too far.
I don't know. It's basically it'll be iterative. This is not going to be the end. I guarantee you. No matter what this finding is, it's going to be challenged again. And this is a very sticky wicket. So. Yeah.
All right, well, let's give Dr. Clark and Dr. Kaplan a good round of applause. Thank you very much, everyone. We will see you next week. Turn in your abstracts and email with any questions about the course. See you all later.